premio che abbiamo consegnato l'anno passato, Human Solvency Prize a Tania Scambrax.
It's you.
Non l'avevamo fatto perché Tania non c'era e quindi rimediamo oggi.
Okay. I have to speak in English. Thank you very much indeed. It's a wonderful pleasure. When I heard about that, I was very touched. I couldn't come here. I deeply regretted it. I'm very happy. It was a wonderful surprise to receive this now at that very moment. So thanks very much again. And I think it's always a pleasure to exchange ideas with such a wonderful public and audience and interested colleagues. Thank you.
C'est nous qui remercions encore une fois pour ce beau travail. Donc on va passer de suite aux conclusions, à la table ronde, disons, qui sous la suggestion de Katia Antunes, va prendre une forme peut-être un peu différente de celle qu'on a eue jusqu'à présent. Donc je vais d'abord donner la parole aux différentes personnes qui sont à la table pour qu'elles expriment ce qu'elles ont retenu, les faits saillants, les points importants qui leur semblent nécessaire de souligner. Ensuite, on vous passera la parole donc aux personnes qui sont dans la salle. Donc préparez-vous. Oui, je vois des gens qui se retournent, des gens en se disant pourquoi je me suis mis si près. Mais donc pour avoir vos impressions et ensuite on reviendra vers les membres de cette assemblée, de cette table ronde. Donc je commence par Katia. Je te donne la parole.
Merci Philippe. Merci Philippe. As I said a little bit before lunch, we're going to keep it short and nasty on our end so that you can come to the fore. And then I would like to ask you to be concise in responding to what we're going to say or bringing to the fore points that you may find important to reflect on. If you can keep it to 3 or 4 minutes each, that would be very helpful to give opportunity to everyone. And I'm going to look at that row there. You were all extremely quiet the whole time, exception made to Juliette. So perhaps an idea that actually once the word goes to that side, that you take actually the stage, because my experience tells me that usually the most interesting work is being done by you guys, because we've been doing this for a while and sometimes you really have interesting stuff to say. So perhaps we need to start with you. After the word goes around to everyone in a short, concise manner, then the word will come back to us, where we will reflect a little bit about the things that actually we did not refer to, or that did not pop out in the discussions we have, and perhaps maybe interesting as either future research agendas or even for future works in the Institute. I will also ask everyone that comes next to take the stage that you speak clearly and slowly at the request of the translators, because they will have a little bit of a harder time because they don't have any written papers for this. So thank you, Philippe, that I may start. So if I would have to reflect on the last days of discussions, I think 3 points come clearly from all the papers and all the presentations. First of all, it is obvious to me that there is in the European mainland a socialization of risk in different forms, in different shades, and that socialization of risk does not happen only in maritime or trading environments, but outside of those groups as well. And that this risk, socialization of risk, does not seem at all times to hold only for highly capitalist environments, although Jeroen held his ground this morning about why the lotteries need to be framed with a capitalist discussion. The second point I would make is the regional diversity of not only of definition of risk and taking of risk, but also on management of risk and, of course, failing to manage risk. And this regional diversity is very interesting because this regionalism, to a certain extent, translates very different worldviews of what risk is, but also of the limits that social groups are willing to take in terms of risk and management of that same risk. And I think the presentations by Maya and Magnus yesterday, because they were next to each other, one after the other, it was clearly the example where this diversity, this regional diversity, is very important. In that sense, I would say, Philippe, the whole idea of perhaps considering a proposal about the economies of mountain for the future calls in the economies of the mountain is actually, I think, a very good idea, because I think these worldviews will come back in these type of discussions. And I think my last point is also a question that has to do with the fact that I think in different papers authors were looking at the importance of individual, private risk-taking, but also institutional risk-taking. And somehow, because of the way research is structured, we tend to kind of separate these two worlds. Institutions are institutional. The Inquisition, the hospitals, the orphanages, versus the individual, the agricultural administrators or the merchants or the industrialists. But actually these two worlds are, of course, we know these theoretically, that these worlds are interrelated, but hardly ever in the research these two worlds have been so well intertwined as in a lot of the papers that we heard here during the week. And I'll stop at that. So I think these are the three main issues that are common to the papers and the presentations since Monday.
Tanya.
Okay, I continue. Thank you very much for this first great impression. I think I didn't prepare a summary of all papers, of course not, but it became clear that there was a certain kind of formalization and standardization in the processes to cope with the forms of over-indebtedness, insolvency, bankruptcy, lack of money in general. So here we go, we have to talk about these terms, I think. And so these were everywhere underway, so there's a lot of similarities, but there is, as was said, also a lot of differences. A number of resilience strategies were in existence already back then, so although they could often not prevent financial collapse of a certain institution or family or entrepreneur, as Markus Denzel has pointed out. Mitigating risk and uncertainty took place on different levels. I have a threefold structure. I chose a threefold structure. Maybe this is a wrong one. On a personal level, we talked about brokers and agents that were, that were staffed and that were enabled to guarantee the exchange of information, for instance, as was pointed out, for instance, in Zellweger's paper. They also collaborated to a certain extent, and reputation of the individual was a very important point here in this individual aspect. But there was a lot of opportunism and lobbyism as well, as I very much enjoyed in your paper. So the question is always about the perception of future regarding risk and the calculation or thinking about risk. So God's role would be an interesting point, role of religion, role of trust, and the role of the common good in all that. So this is the personal level. Then the institutional level, this was my second point. There were new forms and contracts that evolved, insurance contracts, new techniques of accounting, new, like the Biade, the Annone, the pawnbroking houses that I presented, new forms of insurance contracts like the bottomry, all aimed at sharing risks and buffering the effects of a possible loss of income. And then I chose, and I'm not a fan of the state building, and but state and city level. So I think here we have to look at the intertwining, we should look a bit closer into that, the intertwining between the tax system, public credit establishment, and private credit networks. However, sometimes we struggled also with the interpretation of these activities. This was in itself very interesting, actually, and hopefully leads us further. Yeah, so what else? For me, a very interesting aspect I want to come back to, this is the last thing I'm saying here, is what was mentioned also in the keynote, that we have to study economy alongside law or legal history, in that case especially. And I found it very interesting what colleague Dave said in his paper, or wrote in his paper. Of course there were sanctions when people went bankrupt, and they were brought in court, but there was an idiosyncrasy, there were many idiosyncrasies in legal regimes. And this is something that embeds or enables the rooms for maneuver of these actors we are studying. So we have common law, we have the canon law, we have the Roman law tradition, and we have kind of consuetudines, as I would call them. So local habits, how to deal with things. Yeah, so, and then the role of courts was another aspect that I found really intriguing. My question would be also, how did these courts actually work? Because from the studies I know from, for instance, Benjamin Hitz's work, I don't know whether you know it, a Swiss historian who studied credit relations in Basel, in late medieval Basel, he pointed out that these courts actually never worked towards a verdict. They worked towards the prolonging of the process of negotiation between the parties, aiming at a solution outside court, so to maintain peace. So this is maybe the legal side of these economic disputes we have to also keep in mind. Yes, so that would be it from my side.
One of the interesting things about this kind of a format is that it's very tempting to simply say, well, basically they've said it all and just kind of hand it on to the next person. I'm tempted, but I'm not going to do that. As I've listened to the papers over the course of this week of studies, I'm reminded of an old saying in English. I'm sure it has its cognate in most Western languages, and we say often that one can't see the forest for the trees. And for those of you who don't necessarily know what it essentially means that if you attend too much to detail, you forget the commonalities. You don't understand what binds it all together. And it seems to me that this has a certain application to what we're doing here. Yet we're not foresters, and as any forester would tell you, if you don't see the individual trees, then you don't know how to work with a forest. You don't know what makes it up, how to exploit it, or how to maintain it. And it seems to me that the papers we've heard here over this week, as rich and varied as they are, really testify to the varieties of risk and ruin. No two appear to be exactly alike. What one might call the particularities matter. You know, who are the risk takers? In what context, in what kind of an enterprise were they undertaking risk? Were they, say, the managers of a public institution, if you'll allow me the use of the term public, a company? Were they peasants? Were they laborers? Who were they? Because it seems what we've learned this week is that depending on who they were, they saw the risks differently, and they brought to bear different tools, different strategies for the mitigation of those kinds of risks. they all perceived it differently, and they all sought to manage it differently. I could go on, but I think you all get the general point. Independent of the particularities, it seems to me that risk loses meaning as an analytical category, and that begs the question then, are we doomed basically to pursue microhistories, or is it possible to construct a meta-narrative of risk and ruin? I don't have an immediate question. I'll put that out there, and maybe one or the other of you would care to take it up. In immediate response to the question, though, it struck me that there was one challenge that also became apparent amidst the rich variety of papers that we've heard, and that is that we launched two themes this week, bankruptcy and insolvency on the one hand, and risk on the other. And in many instances, we dealt with one or the other, but not both. And that begs the question, are they actually connected to one another? I think that most of us would reply spontaneously that they are. Certainly in the literature, especially the popular, not the legal literature, but the popular literature on bankruptcy that begins to accumulate in the 15th century, being some of the earliest examples that I know, a distinction was made between honest and dishonest bankrupts. The honest bankrupt being the person who became bankrupt through no fault of their own. Force majeure, an act of God, call it whatever you want to, but they basically ran their business properly. They went bankrupt, became insolvent, bankruptcy proceedings were initiated, and then they were upright and strove to settle with their creditors as best they could. The distinction then with the dishonest bankrupt, who basically doesn't recognize and manage the risks. That's what it comes down to. And so one of the things that this meta-narrative, it seems to me, would have to do with something that, subject to your correction, I think we haven't managed as well as we might have, which is to say, to explicitly connect the perception of risk, its management, and then the ways in which that carries over not only into the event of bankruptcy itself, but also in the resolution of bankruptcy, because that decision about how the risks were managed affected how creditors dealt with the bankrupt, the degree of freedom that they were prepared to give them in seeking a resolution, and so on and so forth. I could go on, but then I have a whole list of desiderata that I think we could also add to this business, but I'm going to leave that to the second half of the conversation and pass the floor to Dave.
Okay, as time proceeds, becomes increasingly difficult to say original things, of course, but I'll try. The reason, I guess, why I'm here, Maria Fusaro talked about legal history in the opening speech. I'm a legal historian, and I'm not an economic historian, very interested in economic history, but from a different angle, I would say. Now, some of my observations have to do with some of the differences between the disciplines, and one which struck me when hearing the 29 papers that we saw over the course of the past week, is that the idea of modernity and individualism coming after an era in which communal thinking and socialization, maybe the word has been dropped, of risk was more prominent than, let's say, in the 17th and 18th centuries. I think we saw several examples in which this was not really the case. We talked a lot about networked effects of insolvency. We talked a lot about business contacts, and insolvency seems to have had ripple effects, seems to have been a societal phenomenon, maybe more than an individual phenomenon. And in that regard, I also had the same feeling as Tom just mentioned, the question to what extent insolvency and risk are then connected, because from the angle of legal history, insolvency always has this societal connotation, in the sense that insolvency always depends on the assessment of the creditors, because you can have zero money in your account, but if you have a brilliant project, you will find people who will finance that. Then that would end insolvency, so there's always this element of others judging to what extent you are creditworthy, to what extent your plans are viable and will in the end generate or possibly generate profit. Had some observations on risk and threats and danger, but I think they have been covered for the most part. One thing which was mentioned by Tanya, I want to elaborate a little bit on that. The difference between public and private, it struck me that we talked a lot about threats, dangers that came from the outside, but had to do with the public settings. We talked a lot about the monarchia and sovereign default, the Inquisition. We did not talk a lot about the private problems. So talking about early modern period, the question arises to what extent the new techniques that were emerging, think of double entry accounting, limited liability, were changing bankruptcies. Was it easier to assess bankruptcies maybe? Were there less bankruptcies than before? Had it something to do with the information asymmetry? And I also think that in a perfect world where all information would be shared, there would be no insolvencies. So it would simply be translated in costs, premiums, and interest rates beforehand. So there is always this tension between assessing assessing the information and the person of the debtor as well, and maybe the individual relations of merchants, of firms were very important as well. And I think that this is something which could have been explored more, or maybe can be explored in the future better. There's also, of course, a difficulty, and I think one of the reasons why the public is more prominent than the private, in a sense, is that we have more sources on the public. And that when we have to assess, think of the paper of Magnus Russell yesterday, we have to assess whether a decision was a good decision. We need to have the information that was available to the individual making the decision, and sometimes we simply do not know what they knew. So I also think of the paper of Luis Sales y Fava, where he mentioned that decisions by villagers were also based on the fact that they simply knew what assets the others had. That does not pop up in the sources, but it was information that was at the basis of their assessment. Is insolvency a risk? Are they connected? I sometimes had the feeling that it was a lot about the run-up to insolvency, but insolvency could also be considered as a process in itself in which different decisions have to be taken. And then the aftermath is also very important. We had several papers in which it was also discussed what happened once there was a decision taken to have liquidation, whether there was a possibility to re-enter the market for insolvent and so on. But I think that the emphasis was mainly on the phase preceding the insolvencies than on the actual process and the run-up. So those are my observations. I have some things that were not mentioned, but as I've gathered, I will go into them later. Thank you.
Grazie. Proseguo in italiano facendo 3 gruppi di osservazioni. Quindi abbiamo molte cose sulla diversità istituzionale, sul pluralismo del foro che, come lo sappiamo già da Paolo Prodi, è la regola nel sistema giudiziario medievale e anche moderno. E quindi abbiamo visto molto diverse relazioni che ci hanno parlato dei diversi livelli istituzionali con i quali si può gestire i rischi, quindi non mi dilungo troppo. E quindi questa proliferazione istituzionale, con un'imperfetta separazione delle attribuzioni giurisdizionali, lascia dunque spazio per negoziare, ci dà la possibilità agli attori di gestire, per esempio, prendere un tribunale contro l'altro. In questo panorama vorrei sottolineare come le soluzioni istituzionali, come gli attori e le idee possono circolare. Abbiamo visto in diverse relazioni, per esempio la relazione di Tania sui modelli, sui monti di pietra in Italia e in Germania, ci hanno mostrato in un modo molto bello come sono importati in Germania. Abbiamo visto anche come l'assicurazione nel modello genovese, poi fiorentino, è stato utilizzato a Barcellona, e abbiamo visto anche come l'impero ottomano, volendo essere legato al commercio internazionale, per garantire le transazioni dei latini, ha adattato il suo sistema legale nel modo che si può risolvere le procedure fallimentari. E in questo, il secondo punto in questa diversità istituzionale è l'importanza delle istituzioni di intermediazione, diciamo per esempio i consolati, le nazioni mercantili, gli interpreti, i censali e altri, possono colmare il divario tra questi diversi sistemi, per esempio costruendo una nazione mercantile, firmando dei trattati commerciali bilaterali come le capitolazioni, e fanno il legame tra i due, ma sono anche imperfette, perché per esempio Dave ci ha mostrato come il cambiamento e l'intervento dello Stato più centrale coesiste con le soluzioni vecchie, e quindi le evoluzioni non sono mai lineari e non sono sempre orientate verso una maggiore razionalità. Lo possiamo vedere anche nel campo dei consolati delle nazioni. Per esempio Regina Graf ha studiato le nazioni mercantili a Bruges su un lungo periodo, mostrando che non c'è un modello unico, che le evoluzioni non sono tutte verso la maggiore razionalità e che ci possono essere anche passi indietro. E questo lo ritroviamo anche quando uno studia le nazioni fiorentine, come l'ho fatto, sono organizzate differamente, in modo diverso, perché devono essere accettati tra le autorità e i governi di partenza e quello di arrivo. Il secondo punto che vorrei accennare è il cambiamento della storiografia nel rapporto tra conflitti e economia. I conflitti non sono più considerati come un ostacolo assoluto all'economia. Abbiamo molti studi, per esempio, che mostrano come i conflitti economici possono riattivare antiche rappresaglie, per esempio quello che ha studiato Lorenzo Tanzini per le rappresaglie di Firenze. Quando c'è una tensione tra due città si riprende rappresaglie di 50 o 60 anni fa per fare la guerra economica. Il fatto anche di essere dichiarato come usuraio, tutte le cose che sono state indagate da Giacomo Todeschini, e anche il fallimento che è stato anche che può essere una minaccia, ci mostrano il fatto che la posizione di tutti gli attori sono molto incerte, e quindi tutto questo vuol dire che l'analisi in termini di risoluzione dei conflitti non basta, perché questa analisi implica una brevità del momento giudiziario, che è considerato come anormale, valorizza una visione dell'alto e che gestisce in modo ideale dei giuristi e dei statuti delle leggi, e si considera, come nell'economia classica, forse che il legame è automatico tra pace, concordia e prosperità. Invece, storici come Justina Woops-Morewitz propongono di studiare questi conflitti nel lato della gestione dei conflitti, vuol dire di integrare tutto il processo e basarsi sul punto di vista degli attori. Questo tipo di analisi comprende sia la prevenzione dei conflitti attraverso la negoziazione e la diplomazia, ma anche la loro risoluzione in modo giudiziario, amministrativo e anche informale, possiamo pensare all'arbitraggio, e terza cosa, l'applicazione dei conflitti attraverso la guerra marittima, la corsa, la pirateria e così via. E quindi io faccio questa presentazione un po' dettagliata perché mi ha fatto pensare la bellissima relazione di Marcus Drendel sulle strategie di resilienza, anche i lavori di Marco Di Tullio, e quindi alcune di relazioni hanno provato a mostrare come il rischio è incorporato in tutte le azioni e non è un ostacolo alla vita economica, che abbiamo modi di finire, di continuare la vita economica integrando questi rischi. Ma terzo punto, mi chiedo se invece questo tipo di analisi nasconde forse un po' troppo le crisi, perché abbiamo visto anche che anche quando c'è una resilience management molto forte, una gestione collettiva dei problemi, tutti i rischi e tutti i fallimenti non spariscono, e quindi si pone il problema di pensare a rischi congiunturali e i problemi anche strutturali, e di pensare anche, come l'abbiamo già visto, che le istituzioni, i governi, i dirigenti non sono sempre parte della soluzione, sono anche parte del problema. Quando si pensa per esempio quando è vietato nella penisola iberica i leteri di cambio, quando l'Inquisizione in Maiorca attacca una minoranza ebraica che è molto forte nel settore del credito, eccetera. E quindi le analisi possono anche utilizzare la congiunzione tra la debolezza economica e il ruolo del network sociale e quindi della fiducia del gruppo. Come l'abbiamo visto per esempio per i fallimenti, basta che c'è l'inizio che è lanciato dal dirigente, per esempio, e la fiducia generale crea un'ondata di fallimenti. E quindi questi shock esogeni creano delle crisi impossibili da superare e per esempio si può fare anche il paragone con il nostro periodo, come Joseph Stiglitz ci ha mostrato che per lo shock alla fine del Novecento, che distruggere una banca è da più disagio che conservarle, perché si deve ricostruire tutta la rete sociale e economica che questa banca ha. Quindi ecco, mi fermo qua.
Merci Cédric. Donc maintenant c'est à vous. La parole vous est donnée. Pour éviter que vous ayez à vous déplacer, j'ai un micro. Est-ce qu'il y a déjà des mains qui se lèvent, des audacieux, des téméraires? Non, personne. Je vais aller vous chercher. Donc, j'arrive.
Hi. Oh, yeah. Okay, it's on. Thank you so much for all of the presentations the past few days. There is one overall theme that I saw for all of these presentations, and something that I'm specifically interested in. The overall theme I see is kind of that in all of these presentations. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll talk slower or slower. Okay, I'll talk slower. I see kind of this balancing act of risk-taking, but then again, at the same time, they're also trying to manage and identify and minimize the risk to their best capacity. And I think this balancing act is quite interesting. And what I'm specifically interested in, and I don't think we've discussed this in every presentation, but it's kind of the identifying and assessing risk. What I find interesting is, for example, how does an event that's previously seen as an act of God becomes or transforms into a manageable risk or a commodified risk, which can be insured, for example, and what could be the role of public opinion, law, maybe new financial instruments or new technologies be in this process. And what I also find really interesting is kind of how is risk assessed and who is successful in doing this. And what I'm thinking is how important is expertise, asymmetric knowledge, and experience in this assessment of risk. And what I also think is really interesting is how important are networks in not only distributing risks, but also assessing risk more effectively. And my research is more on the late 18th century and the joint stock companies. So I'm really interested in how, for example, joint stock companies do this compared to maybe private underwriters, for example, and also kind of the shift between marine insurance and fire insurance, I think is really, really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Merci beaucoup de vous être lancé. Je vois que le mouvement est parti, c'est très bien.
Thank you for the different presentation. And during all presentation, for me, I observe that it's really difficult to make to have a clear distinction between insolvency, bankruptcy, or illiquidity issue. And I was wondering if for the judicial courts, for instance, this distinction is more clear or it's not. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for the invitation and for the wonderful conference. I had more two broad comments, actually, that made me think a little bit. The first one is that... Okay. That... Why this is happening? The first one is that I thought there was very European-centered presentations. So I felt like a lack of more broad topics on other areas of the globe or other spaces that were being tangled by the capitalist system, you know, the expansion of the managing of risk and insolvency, for example, in colonial areas. I know that we have a lot of PhD students here that are working, for example, on China. I'm working in Brazil, for example, so I felt like that was missing a little bit. And the other concern was more like what David said, that I felt that
it was missing a little bit of trying to reflect on the concepts that are being used. I felt like for the empirical, it's amazing. But for trying to reflect on the theoretical approach that we are trying to build, that was really missing. For example, at the first day, the first presentations were supposed to be on concepts and theory, and it was not. So I would like to see more trying to understand what these concepts are changing through time. You know, what is the idea behind what is risk, what is more like, and I felt really like there is and it's a common problem in economic history. There is the methodological internalism of the approaches. So like we are focusing on some places or some areas, and we don't try to open a comparison with other areas. So we always are looking to an object internally and thinking that explains everything. But for example, in the questions that we had, we always saw that all the questions were trying to build a comparison with other areas. You know, trying to see how it happened, how it is related with other spaces, other times. So what I felt actually that other presentations had, of course, there is a short time to present, but it was more like a description of the institutions or the legal system that were being created in some kind of spaces, without trying to rethink our understanding of what is risk, what is insolvency, and what is bankruptcy within social changes, you know, so that's it.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think we had a lot of common discussions, and my point kind of echoes what David said. I think we had the same troubling issues with how you went from insolvency to bankruptcy, and where is illiquidity in it, and how do you go from risk to uncertainty, or the way around. And one thing that is ever coming back but never really addressed as such is liquidity and illiquidity, right? And what at some point, despite having the best management that you want, so many diversification, you don't have access to liquidity, and then you go bankrupt, right? And the main problem here is like, why can you have access to like ready money, cash, call it whatever you want, right? And is it a market problem? At some point you cannot have access to financial market and to this kind of liquidity, or is it not just the market but a rather broad institutional problem? And I think we spoke about that with David, because he studied in the 1920s and he has the same problem. And I think if you look at the financial crisis, right, and Perry Merling works, for instance, who work on global financial crisis, you still have this problem. And I think that could be, in fact, a concept or something that is quite trans-historical, but that is never really addressed as such, despite the word liquidity has been here since Monday. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's been a very stimulating handful of days. I'd like to just return to the concept of risk again, because it's a concept a lot of the papers have been drawing on, and I don't think we necessarily all agree about what it is. A lot of us, as Juliette alludes to, we have been using this distinction from Frank Knight between risk and uncertainty, that which can be measured and that which cannot. But I think the vast majority of us are in agreement that even by the end of the early modern period, we still cannot quantify a lot of these uncertainties. So I'm wondering the extent to which really that distinction is useful, or at least the definition is useful to us in our studies, because despite the fact that things apparently haven't changed in terms of the measurability of risk by the end of the early modern period, clearly the situation in terms of risk management, for lack of a better phrase, is very different by the end of the early modern period compared to the start of it, or compared to the start of the medieval period. So I'm wondering if we need to rethink our terminology, rethink how we are understanding risk, maybe not necessarily as being quantified, but commodified or something else. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, I did also learn a lot, and I find also the discussion about the liquidity is extremely stimulating, but I would recommend to give it a slightly different touch and think about, because when you make the argument, okay, people get bankrupt because they have no access to liquidity, then the solution to all of that would be just to give somebody who made bad business decision just a bunch of money so that he can recover and eventually pay everything off. Perhaps it's not that simple as I'm portraying it, but that is what why I get some doubts about that. I would hint at the mistake the market participants did, and this is, in my opinion, asset over evaluation. So they. Sorry, yeah, it's back. So basically, what I got from this conference, all the failures basically result from people giving their liquidity into assets, believing that they have a certain value, and it turns out that they have not. and that leads to, for me, a very interesting. Perhaps I have to move in the room. Question. Whether there were social is there also a part of social history in that? Are there phases where assets tended to be overvalued, like we all feel basically right now in the housing market all over in Europe? And can we there perhaps spot common patterns? Just some preliminary thoughts on that, and because that is something we did not discuss too much in detail. So asset overestimation, evaluation, perhaps this would be a concept that could bring some of these case studies together. Thank you.
So I really enjoyed this. That 10 weeks was super interesting, super stimulating. Honestly, I agree a bit with the fact that we dealt with concepts that were really important, and sometimes they are connected to each other, sometimes no. So my question is more, what if we would have like separated this concept and analyzed them differently? The result of our papers would it be the same? No. But, for example, I'm concerned a bit about what was missing, in my opinion. But maybe I missed something, I don't know honestly. But using a bit Dattini metaphor, Mellis wrote this book named Aspetti della vita economica medievale, so aspects of economic life in the Middle Ages. And I was wondering, have you really investigated these aspects of economic life in the sense? We talk about risk management, insolvency, and bankruptcy from a perspective of institutions, individuals in general. But what I felt like missing was like how really people describe these elements, like how I feel concerning my risk management, how I describe it, how I feel about it, how I feel about insolvency, character, like elements like, for example, can be shame or honor we're talking about that would be super interesting to investigate and still missing in the agenda of historians that deals with economics in these aspects. And also bankruptcy. We have cases where people describe these bankruptcies and still they were not appearing. So my what if for myself, for example, that I deal with individuals was probably I chose the wrong paper. I should have gone for a description of these. We have a lot of sources that can show these, for example, diaries, ricordanze, memoirs, that could have shown aspects more personal related to these situations, and probably would have opened more possibility for discussions. And so I was wondering how to proceed in this way. For example, now there is history of emotions that is investigating capitalism and emotions. Is it the right way for doing that? Because I recall, and I don't know if I'm wrong, maybe it was an hallucination from the warmth, I don't know, but also Professor Sefley mentioned about emotion at some point during this conference. Maybe it was an hallucination, I don't know. But it would be interesting, in my point of view, to analyze these aspects. So more personal conceptions of risk, insolvency, people describing it and say, I feel like that about it, or my shame is huge, like I'm not able to pay back this person. I feel ashamed of that. And that's what I feel missing a bit.
Well, thank you very well for your words. I feel a bit the same. I was limited by the time. Either I do the topic risk management or I do the bankruptcy of those Zellwegers, because there are huge amounts of sources, and I could have said that they lost their long appreciated honor completely by going bankrupt. And of course this is interesting, but it has already been published, so I didn't dare to repeat me here again. So maybe it was too much for one session, risk management and bankruptcy, because either of the topics are grand, huge, and one could really fill papers to discuss them deeply. Thank you.
Someone wants the baton or the power?
Est-ce qu'il y a encore des questions?
It doesn't. Can you hear me? You can probably hear me with. It's the guy in the back.
Il est déjà allumé.
I can't. Hello. Okay, it's working. Sorry. First thing that comes to mind is when you talk about insolvency and bankruptcy, you're talking about debt. Without the debt, it makes no sense to talk about bankruptcy and insolvency. Because you're talking about credit. All you're talking about are creditors. Creditors, right? So they should have added debt to the issue. Because you can have transfer of risk, however, without debt. Risk involves two things: possible loss and intention. In the case of risk transfer, or the risk without debt, you can have an investment, and the investment is lost. The investment itself is not seeking greater gain. Because the question here, of course, also involves capitalism, and capitalism involves gain, the search for ever greater yields. And in the case of debt, you have some people that have more money than they can use, so they give it to someone else that can use it. And whether they use it correctly or not, well, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And then the other point, there's another point about this idea of efficient markets. I don't think the markets were efficient, and I don't believe that efficient markets would be any good for capitalism in any case, because capitalists seek inefficiencies in markets to make their gains. So the idea, I must take you to task on that. I can't let you get away with that, I'm sorry. And then the question of the perte de crédit, creditworthiness, underlies also a lot of things that we said. If you lose your credit, then you can't get any further money from the people that have money, and you're in trouble if you're a capitalist. if you're seeking to enter into the world, the market world, and extend your wealth. And the final thing that I want to say, well, there's also that idea of bounded rationality, but I won't get into that. There's also the question of the commodity chains and the strategy, because the strategy was, I tried to talk about strategy in my paper, for better or for worse. I took it seriously what they asked. And so the last point was what kind of strategies are adopted to avoid this risk. And Mr. Ressel was going to tell us about the vertical integration as a way of diminishing risk. And I didn't really hear that. And other papers, you talked about the question of the markets, the linen market, the producers on the Lake Constance and all that. And that too underlies a commodity chain approach, where you have this chain of value added that goes backwards and forwards and all that, and I won't talk any more about that. And I think I said enough. I'm not going to, deal with this, because, someone else should.
On va revenir maintenant vers la table. Vous pouvez le poser, je viendrai le chercher. Donc, Katia, je te redonne la parole.
Well, this was the whole point of having you guys talking. Thank you for that. Really, thank you very much for that. Perhaps for the clarification, originally, it was risk and bankruptcy, two different things. There was a decision to join both for practical reasons, with arguments for and arguments against. So, out there. I would like, I think, to respond to the room over, I think, 3 points, and then I'll share with you where I think it was also missing, and that perhaps we can move along. I think that what going back, I think, David, right? The point is, there is a danger in, I like the forest. I find it cool listening about the trees, as Tom would say. I am a person who likes the forest. The problem sometimes for people who work on the forest and on theoretical and systemic ideas is that we tend to look for development. And if there's something we learned in the last few days is that there's none. You have non-linear steps that do not necessarily lead to, you can call efficiency, you can call capitalism, modernity, whatever you want to call it. It's just 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and this is about things that make sense for the people at the time. Although, of course, the problem is, in hindsight, we know where the story ends, right? We know the end of these. And I think it's healthy for at least people like me who like a lot the forest, that sometimes we're grounded by the trees because it is not obvious that we're going to end in the 19th century where we started in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. Because I'm very afraid of this idea of developmental, so the development. I think it is development, not development. Having said that, however, I think you guys are very right in thinking about the big elephant in the room. And I think there's 2. One is a question of debt. And I agree with the last comments that you can have risk management, risk transfer, commodification of risk without having debt. You cannot have bankruptcy without having debt. And I think debt, the problem of debt, at least in my own research, is that debt is perceived in different historiographies under different guises. So if you read Anglo-Saxon literature, usually debt comes disguised as credit. And sometimes we don't really understand that behind credit there's always debt. And usually the argument stops as accepting credit as in existence, as if the next step isn't there once the credit becomes that. The problem is that I think debt is not only an economic phenomena, it's a social phenomena, it is also a cultural phenomena. And this comes to your point about the European experience versus the experience of others. I think you don't need to leave Europe for that. I mean, you can, of course, it's great. Great fan of doing that outside of Europe, but you have foreign communities all over Europe that deal with these things very differently, being risk, being credit, being debt. Also management of bankruptcies. So if you look at the Ottomans all over Europe, the Armenians, the Jews, of course, we think of them as diasporas or otherwise religious groups, but in fact what they translate is a different cultural world of debt and a different cultural world of bankruptcy. And that does not mean that those cultural worlds don't work within European institutions, which I think it's perhaps the most interesting about European institutions is that that can take place. And it's not only the institutions, but also the law. But I'll leave that all to Dave. I think what I also share with some of your comments is that there's a few things I missed in these discussions, and I think that it would have been interesting to reflect upon. One is this idea of so when a bankruptcy ensues or when illiquidity ensues, there's a difference between conflict resolution and conflict management, and I think that most of the cases people are actually thinking of conflict management and not on conflict resolution, because resolving conflicts, as some of the examples were evident, will lead to not the good common good. So you will defeat the common good if you actually resolve a conflict. So it's very good to not resolve the problem, but just manage the problem. The second point is, and I missed that a little bit as well, a correlation between typologies of business organization, being in agricultural, industrial, or commercial terms, and increased or manageable risks of bankruptcy. Having shareholding, a shareholding project being infrastructural or business, a partnership, or a public good institution is not the same. So there is a difference in business organization and the predictability of bankruptcies, but also the capacity to resolve or manage bankruptcies. The third point, I think, would be the question whether we can find patterns, and I'm going back to the first point about development, whether we can find specific patterns of behavior across Europe in different moments in time, and whether those patterns of behavior relating to risk management and bankruptcy somehow showcase phases, right? Because I was actually very surprised with the last comment, and I think that applies to the medieval period, but it doesn't apply for the early modern period. You could go bust 10 times, and still you would be able to pick up your business, particularly if you're a merchant and particularly if you're in a large port. So that defeats the whole purpose of all the discussions we've been having about trust. Because if you go bust 3, 4, 10 times in your lifetime, and you can still find capital, find partners, find ways to get into business again, there's one of two things. Either trust is worth nothing, or societies are getting better equipped to actually take in crazy gamblers that are actually businessmen, right? And accommodate for the crazy stuff they're doing. I think it's actually the last point, right? I don't think this applies before the 16th century, but I think that going bust in the 16th, 17th century, even the 18th century, is not really a problem. It depends a little bit on the type of bankruptcy that you, or the liquidity that you have, but mostly you can come out of it quite, well, relatively easily. My last point is the question that we did not discuss, and I think it is absolutely essential to calculate risk and be very thorough in the way we think about bankruptcies. And this is the problem that actually Tessa and Ramona brought about, which is the idea of enforcement of subjecthood, for instance, and property rights across jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are not only institutional jurisdictions, so under which court falls the resolution or the management of a specific conflict, but towards the end of the 16th century to the 17th century, 18th century, is also a question of how do you enforce penalties or tolerance for specific debtors in the market across different countries. And this is particularly important, not so much for the agricultural management, I think, and for industrialists, but for merchants. This is absolutely crucial, that you can discharge debt if you're sitting in whatever small little town in the middle of Switzerland, but you can discharge debt in Amsterdam or Lyon or London. That means that there is something that merchants or businessmen can trust on, and you can call it the word of the law, efficiency of institutions, commonality of understanding of property rights, whatever you want to call it. But if you can do this across jurisdictions, this may just justify the reason why at some point in time, and now I'm going back really to the colleague with the black shirt in the back, that may just justify the fact why after the middle of the 19th century, everyone and their mother is actually jumping into European institutions outside of Europe because of this. The ability to enforce decision-making and, above all, discharging of that across jurisdictions. Nobody else can do this. And that is, I think, one of the issues that may be for the future interesting to trace back. How does this come about? And I don't believe that the answer to this is state formation. The answer is elsewhere. This is my feeling. But I'll stop now. Tanya.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to speak a bit about three aspects that you mentioned. I mean, thanks very much for all your questions and your persistence and your energy you put in this very long conference, which will continue. The first thing is I would like to come back and add something to what was just said by Katja on the topic of debt. I think this is a very central topic, and we can even, I think I would even ask us to broaden our perspective towards anthropology. So to go over time even more, but also to become more interdisciplinary. If you really take it seriously, what we are doing here, so we should, and this answers a bit to your lack of comparison, European centralization, blah. I think that's an important point. You all know Greber's book on Schulden and on debts, the first 5,000 years. I think it's very, very good study showing us what we all do not know and how broad and diverse actually the human activity and human striving for solutions in this, with this problem of debt is. And of course, his understanding of debt is also very interesting. It's nothing to do with money. It's nothing to do with credit. So I recommend this book to you, and this is, I think, it's very good. But then I also want to answer to the same point in a more pragmatic way, because we are all academics and we all know that we can only work on case studies. I have deep respect for people who are universalists, but I think our everyday life as academics, as historians, is bound to case studies. So the critique is somehow, I understand it very well, but the pragmatic everyday today life of a researcher is that you are happy if you have like kind of an idea what this kind of person or institution was actually, you know, like how it comes across in the source material and how we can analyze that. The second point is the distinction between the categories that I have written down as well in my catalogue of what we missed out. And I think one important reason for this diffusion we have to deal with, or we have to discuss actually, is the Historizität, sorry for my German, the Historizität of these terms themselves. This has been mentioned in a certain way already, but I think we really, and this is the difficult part, we have to talk about when these terms are being used. When I look for, in medieval sources, when I look for the risk of bankruptcy or insolvency, and there you are right, the papers didn't fit the title of the first session. I should also have picked another paper then, but okay. I think if we go back to the source material, we see that there are traces of endeavors to define these terms very early on, like Olivi in the 13th century already, or Bernardino da Siena. People like the theologians, like medieval theologians, they were thinking a lot about that, and they offer already some definitions of these concepts. So we have to think about this historical character of the terms themselves, and this was something I really missed in the conference. I also would like to have a paper, if we could recommence now our conference with all what we have learned and know, so it would be cool to have such a paper too. Second aspect, the third one, and this is a very important point that you made, and I also liked very much what you said in your paper. It was really the individual perspective. This was among the points I wrote down, because we tend to neglect that. We always do. We always tell ourselves, come back to the individual, to the actual people in the history. And this is something, so I would be one opting for micro-historical approach as well. So, yeah, to actually see what happened to the people, because bankruptcy and insolvency, they did not just happen to people. People were also able to find solutions, strategies to deal with this. And I think this point is so interesting for me as a historian, also to see, I mean, the survival strategies that Laurence Fontaine also beautifully dealt with in one great article. So I think they helped each other. They took on multiple jobs, they diversified their sources of income, and so on. So what was just mentioned as well, there must be an informal world we cannot know because they're not captured in the sources. And this is what we really have to dig up, trying. But of course, it's patchy. Yeah, so this was my Predigt für Mikrogeschichte.
These are wide-ranging comments, and part of the challenge for the people who sit at the round table is always to try to sift them and synthesize them and then reorganize them. It doesn't simply go mechanically from one person to another. And I guess for my part, I would begin with it may just have been an Oberdichte, but it caught my ear and it kind of stuck in my mind. This question, I think it was part of the very first comment that had to do with risk-taking. I'm always in trouble with these people. I don't understand what they have against me. I mean, I don't talk that fast, I mean, really. The issue was human agency. That's the term that I heard, and I hope I heard it correctly. And it strikes me that whether one does Mikrogeschichte or strives for a kind of meta-narrative of risk-taking, risk management, is this notion of human agency as something that changes over time. The boundaries are never entirely clear, I would submit. But that the concept of what human beings should be held responsible for managing, what they can manage and should be held responsible for managing, is something that shifts over time, and it's central to our deliberations here. It hasn't necessarily been addressed or discussed expressis verbis, but I would submit that it has been implicit in a great deal of what goes on. And I think part of that can be captured in terms and concepts. To come back to a very just, I think, intervention with regard to our shared session, the very first session. I mean, on the one hand, we're not responsible for what the organizers of the Datini decide to label our session. I mean, we weren't asked, it was just put there. but it's certainly true. The problem becomes, though, that the terms are themselves ambiguous. I mean, you've heard mentioned Frank Knight, you've heard Luhmann's notions of risk or uncertainty brought up, and again, they kind of, Knight certainly turns on this notion of measurability. But what is actually measurable, what we find measurable, is not necessarily what our agents found measurable. The wonderful discussion of the Catalan maritime insurer, whose name now escapes me, forgive me, wonderful paper in detail such as I've never seen it, showing about how these guys engaged in risk margin pricing and all kinds of things that are wonderfully sophisticated. But the one thing that he couldn't do, because it didn't exist at that point, was engage in probability analysis. You know, a particular ship with a particular cargo on a particular route by a particular crew, what's the likelihood that it's going to be taken by pirates or sunk? The theory doesn't exist, the technique doesn't exist. He's measuring a great deal, but he's not measuring that. We call it insurance. It's not modern insurance. It's not modern insurance. You can call it risk sharing if you want to, or risk mitigation and all that kind of stuff. But modern insurance companies, maritime insurers, reinsurers, they have huge actuarial tables, they have huge tables of events, hundreds of thousands, and they calculate the odds. It's insurance, but it's not the same thing. The terms are, in and of themselves, ambiguous. Debt is another ambiguous term. Yeah, we all know what debt is, but debt is an asset. It's also an asset. The merchants that I deal with are all illiquid in the strict sense of the word. That's how they do their business. They always have more obligations than they have cash on hand. But people trust, to a certain extent, that they're good for it. Insolvency occurs when the notion gets around that they're no longer good for it. It's not just a matter of having insufficient resources in the moment. They have insufficient resources in perpetuity, and they're done. And then bankruptcy ensues, which is basically the imposed or negotiated resolution of outstanding obligations at that point. But the terms themselves are ambiguous. So I would submit that although concepts, the kinds of theories that have such great currency in all of our writing. It's very important to be able to quote Luhmann. It's very important to be able to quote Knight. We're all concerned about Knight's notion of, is this uncertain? I was too. And yet you forget that Knight is basically writing a triumphalist narrative of modern capitalism. He doesn't care about the history of the business. He uses his notion of uncertainty and risk to justify the capitalist, who by risk-taking earns his profit. It's a triumphalist narrative of modern capitalism. What's the application to the past here? I mean, do we really need to waste our time with this guy? I had if you saw the paper I posted, I had like 3 pages on him. And then it came time to present the thing, and I thought, this is a lot of crap. I'm going to get rid of this. Who cares? Not relevant to my agents. What we need to know is what they thought. And this comes back, Tanya, to what you were saying, to what many of you are driving at. What do they find is essential to measure? What do they feel as honest or honorable businessmen that they have to account for, in order to have a reasonable chance of success? I'll give you another example. In the 1560s, a fellow by the name of Hans Mader, a Nuremberg mathematician, goes and writes what is probably the first German language book on business techniques. And it's a catalog of every conceivable commodity the German merchants are trading, where they get it, what it costs at the source, all of the transportation costs, the tolls, duties, the bribes, the various markets, what you're likely to make on the market. They talk about it. He reduces everything to a kind of a mathematical calculation that yields a legitimate or reasonable, whatever reasonable is, profit in the end. He dedicates the book to one of the worst speculators and usurers, a guy who plays completely on the margin, a fellow by the name of Bonifacius Fürstenbach. We know almost nothing about this character except he was a scoundrel. And so the ideal audience on the one hand and the person to whom the book is dedicated occupy opposite poles of what one might call the spectrum of legitimate business in the early modern period. I could go on and on. The ambiguity of terms, the ambiguity of concepts, and my question back to you is, what do we really need to know? You know, if we're going to learn about the past and use the past as something that instructs us, you know, when we confront our problems in the present, we don't need Luhmann. What we need is what they thought was legitimate, necessary in order to do. You know, and then we play that off against, you know, we don't use Luhmann as the point of departure, or we don't use Knight as the point of departure. We don't use these kinds of theories and concepts. We basically say, here's how it was different under different circumstances. Here's how it functioned under different circumstances. This might suggest why it does or does not function in our circumstance, and I'll stop at this point. Oh, one more thing. I love the idea. I love the idea of the. I basically wrote down. What did I write down? I basically wrote down the colonial impact of risk management. I think that's absolutely essential. We get outside the kind of the Judeo-Christian cosmology for a moment, and the needle on human agency takes a jump in a direction that we absolutely don't understand, that we can't account for in the West. What does this tell us? About, because they had merchants, and bankers. How did they measure it under a completely different set of assumptions about the way the world is organized, and what people should and should not do, what people can and cannot do. That's an absolute desiderata, it seems to me, of any further discussion of bankruptcy when we try to plug it in not only to economic life, but to a globalizing, and I'll say as an American, a global economy that cannot be reversed. The notion, is absurd. But forward-going global economy, to take those into account and make them part of the conversation. And now I will stop.
Yes, I think that many things have been said, and also some of the things that I anticipated on saying. But one aspect that is quite interesting, and this notion of band-wide, what is acceptable according to the contemporaries. And one aspect that has not been mentioned, I think, and which, coming from legal history, is something that is more common in our literature, so to speak. The fact that there is a certain contractualization going on of reputation, and then you have the tension between who is going to decide what is appropriate and what is not. Because, as was mentioned by Katja, you have examples of bankrupts, even bankrupts having committed fraud, who after a while can return to the market, can obtain new contracts, can obtain credit, gain acceptance again. Whereas, for example, in the 14th century, maybe, merchants tended to be members of guilds, stricter rules, and you had the mechanism of exclusion when somebody behaved in a certain way. So that's a question of who is deciding what the rules are. And there is no clear answer to that, considering the state of the literature, I think, on commercial scenes in Western Europe, 16th, maybe even 17th century as well. One final point, I think it would be interesting for economic historians to look closer into literature of law and economics, because there is an entire body of literature on the behavior of firms in financial distress, and even with respect to insolvency and pre-insolvency proceedings. The question, do we try to obtain an agreement extrajudicially? Do we go to court? Do we hire lawyers? Asset valuation questions, mergers, capital injections, and so on and so forth. There is a lot of empirical literature on that, mostly for the recent period, but I think it would be interesting to maybe at one point try to combine some of the insights. It could be interesting because that could trigger some research questions that have not been asked beforehand, and maybe even starting from historical sources of previous periods could be answered, and also allow us to compare across periods as well. So I also agree with the colonial aspect. I think that stepping outside of the bubble is important. To what extent are we not always talking about the same things, and maybe the analysis of practices, beliefs with regard to insolvency or broader debt in the colonial context could also shed a better light on what we know about our own past, at least the Western European one. Thank you.
Dal mio lato concordo con molte cose che sono già stato detto e volevo anche insistere sulla storia del vocabolario, la lessicografia. Penso che possiamo fare in modo più approfondito una storia dei concetti, a quale epoca comparsero e a quale epoca diventano dominanti. Per esempio sono stato stupito dal fatto che la parola imprenditore prima, nell'Ottocento, era prima un architetto, prima di essere un fornitore, e quindi c'è un dibattito tra, per esempio, Alain Guiraud e Sylvain Piron per sapere quando compare la nozione di risicum nel rischio, e quindi ci sono stati molte indagini, per esempio quella che è stata condotta da Philippe Bernardi, Patrice Beck e Laurent Feller sulla remunerazione nel Medioevo, dando un spazio molto importante alla storia del lessico e di quali sono le parole che sono state utilizzate. Quindi è vero che forse in nostro dibattito i concetti, la dottrina, la concettualizzazione del rischio è stato meno indagato, e quindi forse bisognerebbe studiare il retroterra culturale, che permette di sapere se una nozione è plausibile o no. Per esempio sappiamo che con gli studi di Giovanni Ceccarelli, che già del 200 i canonisti francescani e domenicani, quando riflettono sulle scommesse, sul gioco d'azzardo, stavano già considerando che il rischio può essere valutato e scambiato con denaro, e quindi ci dà un po' un'idea di quello che si può fare. E sempre anche Giovanni Ceccarelli ci ha studiato come la storia della matematica, la storia della probabilità, mostrando per esempio che quando compaiono gli scritti di Luca Pacioli, infatti riassumono 2 secoli di pratiche dei mercanti. Quindi sarebbe ottimo se possiamo fare un'indagine che comporta sia un'analisi delle termini, delle parole, della pratica e anche della letteratura, della dottrina giuridica, e forse con gli strumenti più moderni di ripensare la storia e di fare altre... di rivisitarla. Grazie.
It's your train.
So I would like to return to one thing, back to Tom. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Jean. So I'm not convinced that looking at bankruptcies, I'm not convinced that looking at debt outside of the European paradigm will deliver what I think you both so much want. And the reason why I say this is because I've been fighting with this for about 25 years. And what the sources say, so when you look at sources from Japan and China and Southeast Asia and South Asia, the Mughal, Persian sources, even sources from the Sahel, right, in Arabic, what you get from these sources and from the European sources is 2 things that are common. One is that everyone understands worldwide, with or without Europeans, the notion of reciprocity. So when I have A and I give Tanya A, Tanya understands that by receiving A, something needs to come back, B. culturally, where the discussion ensues is about whether what Tanya is going to give me back, so making good on reciprocity, is of equal value. So the fight, or the cultural fight, if you're an economic historian, you say the market problem is to determine value. It's not the fundamental understanding that reciprocity needs to ensue once A goes to someone else's hands, right? So we have that in common. The second thing we also have in common is that we all, religions of the book or outside of the religions of the book, is that if the reciprocity is not met, that everyone understands that a debt ensues. Now, culturally, different systems call debt different things. It can be an obligation, it can be debt, it can be lack of reciprocity. And what is interesting, and I think that is in that paradigm that we need to look for the comparisons that you were suggesting, is that culturally, not all the systems resolve the unbalance of reciprocity equally, and not all the systems socialize the lack of reciprocity equally. So that is where we get to the point of whether a debt is a material or social or immaterial debt, and how you force someone into fulfilling that. And that's, so what kind of punishment, right? I mean, if the Japanese owe money, you can take your life, you can offer your family into enslavement. If you are in other societies, you know, Europeans pay interest, right? So you need to pay back with interest if you have that. So in that sense, I think pretty much if you would write a global history of exchange, pretty much the idea of reciprocity and of the ensuing of unbalance if reciprocity is not met, I think that is common. I think where systems deviate is in how you establish market value for the reciprocity. That's one. And the second is how do you force or punish lack of meeting reciprocity. And I think that that's where cultural matters. The problem is that when you look at the 19th century, you see that this diversity of approaches starts to be pushed out of the system because the market does not accommodate alternatives that are not the Western ones. But it's not clear, even by the 1770s, that this is the way we're going. It's not clear for the people, and back to your point, in 1780, 1790, a Chinese person in Canton or even in the Jungar markets in Central Asia does not know that the rules of the game are going to be any different than they have been. We just know that now. They did not know that then. Yes, that. And I think that matters if you think of that as the core value of bankruptcy, because then it is to be expected that bankruptcy is then culturally very different, because that is perceived very differently culturally, I think. I'm not sure that global historians would agree that at any point since the 12th century there's not capitalism, actually even earlier in China or Japan or South Asia. I think we're past that stage, but that's me, or the people I read. Let's put it like that. And in that sense, Europe is lagging behind, really lagging behind.
On va quand même arrêter là. vous pouvez parler sur le chemin de la gare, il n'y a pas de problème. Mais c'est une des qualités des semaines d'Attigny de ne pas chercher à clore une discussion, mais à l'ouvrir aussi. Et je pense que dans ce sens, cette semaine y a réussi. On le voit puisqu'on n'arrive pas à la fermer, cette discussion. Donc je voudrais d'abord remercier les personnes qui sont venues à cette table pour cette conclusion, cette table ronde. Donc merci beaucoup à vous. Et aux personnes qui sont intervenues dans la salle, bien sûr. En fait, je voudrais profiter de... Oui Non, pardon. Non, je voudrais profiter donc pour clore cette semaine, de remercier tous les intervenants, mais aussi le public, parce que c'est un échange, et cet échange, il a été, je pense, intense, fort. Et il y a aussi ce que disent les gens, mais il y a aussi ce que leur renvoie le public, et ça, c'est extrêmement important. Je voudrais aussi remercier ma complice Angela Orlandi, qui, ne se contentant pas d'organiser les semaines de main de maître, nous a ouvert le d'Attigny sur la ville avec ses belles expositions. Je voudrais remercier les membres du comité scientifique qui préparent, mais qui aussi font vivre ces semaines d'Attigny. Remercier Francesco Amanati qui veille, entre autres, sur la publication de nos travaux, ce qui est un versant important, moins visible pendant la semaine, mais très important. Et aussi notre Dream Team, toujours souriante et efficace, Federica Nigro, Laura Bruschettini et Laetitia Finecchia, qui est ici. Les techniciens, qui ont une fois de plus fait que tout s'est déroulé sans encombre, dans la plus grande discrétion. Et enfin, celle et celui qui, dans l'ombre aussi, ont assuré la tâche, pas toujours facile, de traduire nos propos, avec une intelligence qui n'a rien d'artificiel. Donc, je vous propose d'applaudir tout ce monde-là, et nous avec, pour clore cette chose. En espérant vous retrouver aux prochaines Settimane qui seront consacrées aux associations de métiers. Merci, au revoir. Il n'y a pas de trompette pour clore la session, mais je suis désolé si quelqu'un veut se dévouer pour le faire. Au revoir, merci à tous.